Um, so after the psychedelic renaissance, cultural challenges and the law of unintended consequences. So this talk is titled After the Psychedelic Renaissance because it's a thought experiment in what things might be like after the present renaissance, so 15, 20 years in the future. It says cultural challenges because I believe that the greatest challenge that psychedelics present us with today is not legal or scientific, but cultural. And the law of unintended consequences has to do with the fact that almost nothing ever comes out as planned. So my name is Jeronimo Mazarrasa, and I work for the iSeries Foundation. We are an NGO based out of Barcelona, and our aim is to transform the relationship of our societies, that is societies of the global north, with a number of psychoactive plants that have a history of traditional use. Now, this job of transforming this relationship has two parts. One part is obvious, in a way, and it's reactive. It is reactive in the sense that there are certain pressing needs, and we try to react to these needs by implementing solutions. So, for example, there are a number of holes today in what science knows about ayahuasca. We try to identify these holes, and then we look for funding in order to carry out the research that will provide the missing evidence. So, this is for example, there are certain holes in what science knows, where there's a lot of research now about, sort of medical aspects of ayahuasca and potential applications of ayahuasca in the sort of medical context. And we know more and more about this. But we don't know so much about how it affects people who are generally healthy, which happen to be actually the majority of the people using ayahuasca. So we're now doing research using global mental health markers, which is basically a set of markers that are shared between many scientists in many different studies. What that means is that then you can use this study, you can make a study using the common markers, and then you can compare the population of the study to other populations of other studies that were using the same markers. So with this in mind, we made this study of healthy ayahuasca users that we would try to compare to the population at large, and it came with some pretty interesting results. Perhaps this is one of the most interesting. 56% of the sample reported reducing their use of prescription drugs due to ayahuasca use. Now, this has very real implications, for example, for public health policies. This actually means that people who drink ayahuasca cost the public health system less money. That are actually cheaper than your average non-users. So, this is an example. Another example of this, which many of you know, is this is the Ayahuasca Defense Fund with, Bia, Charlotte, and also Ben Christie have been involved in different phases. And it's basically a project that we set up to provide legal support to people who are in conflict with the law for working with psychoactive plants. So we provide support, we give advice to the legal team, and we help with expert witnesses to help argue that people who are working with these plants should not be in jail. Since we started, we've supported more than 135 legal incidents in more than 27 countries, and there's been some very important positive rulings, including a case of mambe, which, as you know, is coca leaf. It's a way to consume coca leaf, that we supported with the charges against the accused were dropped. I think there was 2 kilos of coca leaf. And originally, he was being accused of importing 2 kilos of cocaine, which is, pretty serious anywhere. And there was also a very progressive ruling in 2016 regarding ayahuasca, where the judge determined that ayahuasca is not a controlled substance under international or national law, and this was in the sentence. And there's a very recent one where we helped defend a Bolivian immigrant who traveled to Spain with 5 kilos of coca leaf for their own personal chewing and that of their community. So, this is the real psychedelic renaissance. This is the temptation of St. Anthony. Check it out, it's really trippy. But anyway, like I said, as you see, both of these things are in a way reactive measures. So they are reactions to present needs. People are getting arrested, we try to do something about it. There's holes in the science, we try to do something about it. But today I would like to talk about something else that is something that has really been keeping me up at night for quite some time. And it has to do with the suspicion that if the legal and scientific barriers that we face today fell today, so if things were the opposite of what they currently are, if the government was actually knocking on our door saying, we're interested in integrating psychedelics into society, what should this look like? We might not have as clear an answer as we think. I mean, a number of smart people, Hattie here included, have been working on a number of proposals of how this regulation could take place. but what are we doing at the community level? And that's what's keeping me at night, is what comes after the psychedelic renaissance. Because I suspect that far from being the end of our problems, it will be the beginning of a whole new set of challenges. And what are these challenges? The Japanese say that when all you have is a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. With this, they mean that the tools that we have at our disposal, they help us on one hand, and on the other, they shape and limit our perception of what can be done, of what is possible. So when reality is wider than our tools, when it's wider than our frames, when there's a lot more things in life than nails, and this tends to happen a lot, if not all the time, then the result is often this. We try to fit round pegs into square holes, in the process amputating the parts that simply don't fit the categories that we're holding. I'll give an example so this is more clear. As you know, yoga comes from India and was originally focused in the spiritual development through body awareness and movement. In a way, it was a sort of moving meditation. However, in our culture, we don't really have a space for something that combines movement and prayer. So we often fit it on the space that we already had, which was the place for movement, which is called the gym. Now, in many cases, not in all, but in many, we amputated much of the original spiritual aspects that came with the practice, the Sanskrit, the esoteric teachings, and we potentiated the physical and health aspects. The result is that in some, not all, but in many places in the West, yoga is not practiced as a path to enlightenment, but as a path to an attractive body. Now, I don't come to talk about yoga, but about how our societies find spaces to fit new foreign practices. Because I believe that the ritual use of certain plants, in this case ayahuasca, present our societies with similar challenges. We don't have spaces for these practices, so we tend to hammer them in the slots we have. For example, ayahuasca has recently been included in a box that we already had. It's called the New Psychoactive Substances box. However, ayahuasca is not new, it's ancient. It's not a substance as much as it's plants, and its context of use is totally different from that of new research chemicals that people tend to consume recreationally, which were the reason why the new psychoactive substances category was created in the first place. But that was the box that we had, so that's the box where it went. Part of the work that we do at ICEERS is looking at ways to avoid that these practices are hammered into the boxes we have instead of the boxes where they might belong. So I'm going to focus on a single case, which is ayahuasca, and I'm going to try to bring to light the actual object as opposed to the boxes that we might have for it. So I'll be doing that so that from there we can think about possible solutions within our societies, the societies where we live, which are not the Amazonian societies from whom these practices originate. Now, as all of you know, in Columbus's time, spices, pepper, ginger, turmeric, that came from the East were literally worth more than gold. They were so valuable and so special, and the flavors were so mind-blowing for the time that aristocrats would put them on a tray in little piles, and their guests would just eat them directly, like they were candy or something. They were so valuable that they weren't even thinking of mixing them with food. And they found the flavor so surprising, so out there, that it was theorized that these plants couldn't be natural, but somewhat magical, that they grew on the banks of the rivers that flew out from the Garden of Paradise. It is these wonderful plants of indescribable flavors and really high prices that led Columbus to look for new routes to India in order to stop paying for the Portuguese that already had the route around Africa. Now, we already know what happened. Instead of finding a new route to India, Columbus found America, and a very rich botanical exchange began, but just not the one that Columbus had imagined. In fact, the chronicles of the time tell us that for many years, people in the court made fun of Columbus. They're like, hey, Columbus, where are the spices? Discovering new lands was seen as having no value. What I want to say with this is that the fact that in remote countries there are plants with fascinating virtues is not new or tangential. It's been an engine of historical change at a massive level with very marked consequences. And as we will see, it continues to be so. For example, this is the so-called Columbian Exchange, the Columbian Botanical Exchange. The New World gave us a series of plants like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, And in exchange, Europeans also brought other plants to the Americas, like bananas and mangoes that come from Asia, or coffee, which does not come from Colombia, but from Yemen. To give an idea of the scale of the effects of this exchange, potatoes and corn are single-handedly responsible for 25%, one-fourth of the population growth in Europe for the next 200 years. Coffee today is the second most traded commodity in the world, with South America leading production. So we're talking about true historical and economical forces, economic forces. We're not talking about something small. This is so large that it's actually invisible because it's everywhere. Another example is the coca leaf, which is a plant that can be said to have taken over the world, except it did so being split in two. Cocaine in one side, which can be found in just about any city in the world today, and then the other half, which is decocanized leaf extract, which is to this day part of the Coca-Cola's secret formula. Every time you drink Coca-Cola, you're drinking some coca leaf extract. So nowadays, you can find coca products and byproducts in every last corner of the world that can be called, quote unquote, connected to civilization. So plants have power, and there are some plants that are truly powerful. And in many ways, the only reason we don't realize that is because it's so large, it literally becomes invisible, like Coca-Cola. But this doesn't happen in a straight line. Tomatoes in Europe at first survived only as garden ornamentals. So the people kept them because they thought they looked beautiful in their garden and nobody was thinking of eating them. It took more than 200 years for the Italians to turn them into food, tomato sauce, pizza, we know the story. The adoption of potatoes as food in Europe is also measured in hundreds of years. On the other hand, tobacco was already consumed in Japan 50 years after the discovery of America. The only other import that crossed the world just as quickly was syphilis, which is also an American import. So this is another exchange of powerful plants that we might be more familiar with. This is between the old and new worlds. No? This is the interchange of plant teachers or psychoactive plants. There's also a pattern that can be observed here, and it's that the plants travel, but not the knowledge that is associated with them. By this, I mean that each culture, given enough time to live with plants and substances, tends to find spaces and develop a body of best practices that maximizes the benefits and reduces the harms. So I'll give an example. You know, in the Mediterranean, where I'm from Spain, we've had a relationship with wine that is now many, many thousands of years old, probably more than 10,000 years old. And consequently, we have developed a culture around it that comes with a number of rules. For example, times of the day. Wine is not drunk for breakfast, although potentially there's nothing stopping you from doing it. And then even down to certain ways to brew it, certain ways to prepare it, certain containers and temperatures that enhance the benefits and reduce the risks. So that we can live what I would call mostly a quite positive relationship with this drink. So much so, for example, that if we were offered to change a glass of wine for its equivalent in active compound, that is pure ethyl alcohol, the vast majority of us would not want it. Similarly, an indigenous Kogi or Makuna, for whom the consumption of coca leaf is an ancestral ritual of regular practice and extreme cultural value, would show a similar disgust if we offered to change their carefully collected and roasted coca leaf for pure cocaine. Why would they want that if the coca leaf is much richer, tastier, and much less toxic experience? However, if we offer them the same pure ethyl alcohol, well, the same pure ethyl alcohol that we had rejected, well, there may be some interest. Likewise, many Westerners are quite interested in pure cocaine. So we see the pattern. Cultures use and or abuse substances depending on the nature of the relationship they have been able to develop with them. I would argue that both prohibition and the purification of active compounds that comes with this prohibition tend to make this encounter much more complicated. But I digress. From America to Europe, we see this pattern again and again. Cocoa was a bitter drink for the Aztecs, and there was a very elaborate ritual around its preparation where getting the right amount of foam on top of the drink was paramount. This was so important that in the Aztec court, you had one person that was the expert foam maker whose only job was to get the cocoa foam right on top of the cocoa drink. So this is as elaborate as now, or this magic that you're seeing happening with cappuccinos. and one imagines that this bitter drink that they were drinking with cocoa must have been really, really delicious. However, we took that and turned it into a solid, sweet tablet. Tobacco in South America is a very strong plant, Nicotina rustica, used occasionally and not just smoked, insufflated, drunk, chewed, licked. We took a weaker species, Nicotina tabacum, reduced its potency even further by mixing it with crap, basically, and we put it in fine cigarettes of constant and compulsive use. Of all the plants that have come to us from the America, our use never quite resembled the original. And with this, I would argue, we lost some of the accumulated wisdom, or others would say best practices, that came from their original context. It does not seem far-fetched to say that someone ignorant but interested in wine would do well to start by studying winemaking in the Mediterranean basin. After all, there's 10,000 years experience on it. By that same rule of three, someone ignorant of coca would do well to start by asking those who have hundreds or thousands of years of relationships with the leaf, such as the Kogi of the Macuna. Well, in the last 500 years of exchanges, we see this has almost never happened. The plant is taken and the original context is discarded. And that's the pattern. Until we reach ayahuasca, and something happens that, in my opinion, is unique to these times. This happens. Now, this is an ayahuasca ritual in Peru. As a parenthesis, I will say that I'm going to use a very reduced, very reductionistic lens. The indigenous cultural body around these plants is of dazzling richness. It is mythology, poetry, culture, spiritual, political. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on something that is in the global north we would call best practices. This is also a box of ours that amputates the rest. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to focus on this. So this is an ayahuasca ritual in Peru. What do we see? A group meets to take ayahuasca, led by a facilitator or guide who has more experience, directs the session, and takes responsibility over the experience of the participants. If we came to Europe to an ayahuasca ritual, what would we see? Well, we would actually see something very similar. A group meets to take ayahuasca, led by a guide who has more experience than the others, administers the dose, directs the session, and takes charge of the experience of the participants. Many times, even the songs and the rituals are the same as in South America. In other words, an American power plant has been imported for the first time in history with significant parts of the original context. This had never happened before, not with tobacco, not with coca, with cocoa, with mushrooms, you name it. It never happened. So now the question is, what is being imported? And in which pegs, in which boxes can we fit this? And here's where we begin to run into problems, because Amazonian ayahuasca users present us with something like this. So this is a three-dimensional figure, as you can see. The thing with three-dimensional figures is that depending from which angle you look at it, they change shape. So if you look at it from above, directly above, it looks like sort of an L. But if you look at it from this side, it looks like sort of a square. And then if you look at it from that side, it looks like a sort of a trapezoid. Well, actually, the figure is three-dimensional and has all of these things and then some. I posit that ayahuasca presents us with a similar challenge. You can look at it this way and you say, well, this is a spiritual practice. This is related to spirituality. And there is truth in there. There's also truth that it doesn't really conform with what we would define as religion, because we don't really have a peg for spirituality that includes high doses of hallucinogenic substances. And calling shamanism a religion, for example, can be also problematic in many aspects. Now, if you look at it this other way, you could also say that this is actually therapeutic. It is a medicine. And indeed, there is truth in there as well. But also, we don't have a peg for this guided pharmacology, for medicines whose effects require being accompanied by the doctor while they're happening, instead of take this pill and go home. Much less medicines that sometimes ask the doctor to take them together with the patient. Now, this is a completely new ground, in Western medicine. And then, if you look at it this way, it looks like something that we could call education or learning or personal development, personal growth, what in the original culture would be called teachings. Except these teachings do not really conform with what we understand as education, and we definitely don't have a lot of spaces in our culture for the idea of learning from plants. So we are faced with a new object, a different thing, a prism that looks different depending on how we look at it. And the problem is this, which is that while all of these perspectives are true, that it is spiritual, it is educational, it is therapeutic, the truth is neither one of these perspectives, but the whole thing at the same time. So, and the problem, of course, is that we don't have a category, we don't have a box for anything even closely resembling this strange three-dimensional object that fits in many categories at the same time. Not even that, the categories that we do have and seem to approach this are actually too limited, and they tend to amputate good parts of this actual original object. So the danger is not to realize that although what we have in our hands, it's a hammer, what we have in front of us is not a nail, it's something else. You can also notice that even this metaphor of the 3D object that I just presented, it's itself a hammer that nails down differences, because it doesn't contemplate recreational use, creativity uses, and many other uses that are present today, because I couldn't draw a 7-dimensional object because we can't even see them, right? So, you know, we speak of psychedelics as drugs, or as sacraments, or as teachers, or perhaps, as Jonathan Ott once suggested to me 20 years ago, perhaps it's better that we think of them as foods, a type of superfood, you know, the food of the gods. But it's clear that what we have is a figure that does not enter in any of the pegs that we as a culture have today. And again, we risk doing this, just, you know, forcing it in by amputating all of these parts that are just extra, that we can't deal with, that we don't even know what to do with. So how can we avoid this? I mean, you know, it's great to make an ornamental plant out of tomatoes, you know, but the world would be a much sadder place without tomato sauce and pizzas and all of these things. So, you know, what can we do? The other thing that plays here is the law of unintended consequences. The law of unintended consequences, well, I mean, here you can see a very graphic example of how that works, right? You have an intention, something else happens. You know, it's a name given to the maddening fact that every new solution to an existing problem tends to bring with it new and sometimes worse problems. This is a very visual example. And there's one part, you know, there's one part about the law of unintended consequences that is sort of rather simple, and is that, okay, everything comes at a cost. New solutions will bring new costs. Some of these costs will be unforeseen. This is simple. The other part is maddening and chaotic, and it has to do with the nature of interventions over complex systems, which always have unpredictable results. This is not predictable in any way. A classic example, of course, was alcohol prohibition in the 1920s in the USA. Alcohol was and still is linked to all sorts of trouble, accidents, violence, destruction of human beings. So the hypothesis was that if we ban alcohol, then alcohol-related problems will go down. In fact, what happened was that the problem got much worse. Things went from a system of many small-time alcohol suppliers to consolidated the hold of large-scale organized crime. Since alcohol was still popular, criminal organizations producing alcohol were well-funded and hence also increased their other activities, their influence, the corruption of the system, the violence. I mean, you know the story. The alcohol prohibition was eventually recalled, but we're still dealing with the unintended consequences of other prohibitions. I think it's fair to say that most of us in this room are anti-prohibitionist. I am, at least. But as aware as we are of the unintended consequences of prohibition, what would be the unintended consequences of ending prohibition? Are we thinking enough about this? Because we have some early examples. For example, in Canada, where cannabis was decriminalized, you know, as Charlotte was saying, cannabis was decriminalized and a legal path was paved for cannabis production and distribution. Like all new solutions, this came with new costs. The cost of administrative regularization of any activity is, first of all, an administrative cost. Not just taxes, but paperwork, bureaucracy, etc. So what happened, there was a legal path laid, and you had to institute a legal company, get a bank account, register with the tax office, all of these things. And what you found that there was a group of people that were traditionally cannabis growers. Impossible, really? Yeah? 5, 10. Okay, yeah, no, I'm getting to the end. It's good, I'm good. so what happened basically is like the rules, the new bureaucratic rules that had to be followed in order to legally produce cannabis were too much for most of the people that had been living on an informal economy, but they were the traditional pot grower community. And in the other hand, and so they couldn't follow these things and they couldn't do it. And on the other hand, they were perfectly assumable by all sorts of companies that were not from the cannabis world, but that they had lawyers, accountants, and experience in setting up companies and running businesses. The result is that the people that were traditionally growing marijuana, which is actually the ones that had the most knowledge, were pushed out of this new legal system, and they couldn't even enter it. And the perverse consequence of this is most of them were denied of their previous way of living, because there's also severe penalties for people who are illegally selling cannabis in a place where cannabis is regulated. The perverse result of all of this is that many of them ended up going to deal harder drugs. So this is the law of unintended consequences. And this is the danger that we face, is that we think that the challenge facing psychedelics today, it's legal or it's scientific, and that our problems might be solved by a combination of decriminalization, medicalization, and harm reduction. But my intuition is that the resistances that we see in mainstream science and state law to psychedelics are not the problem, but the symptom of the real problem, which is that culturally, as societies, we are complete novices in the arts of handling psychedelics, interpreting psychedelics, administrating psychedelics, policing psychedelics, and regulating psychedelics. We have never done this before. We are very new at this, and we know how many mistakes novices of anything from dance to tennis make before they learn. So, for example, I'm a keen supporter of the medicalization of psychedelics. I think people like Maps or Beckley are doing a fantastic job. I think that it's a good thing that doctors will be able to prescribe these substances to people who need them and who currently have appallingly bad options. However, in our societies, we have significant penalties for people who practice medicine or administer prescription medicines without a medical license. So while I think it's commendable, for example, that psilocybin one day will be available to people with depression, I think it would be sad if that means that in the future only licensed psychedelic therapists can work with it, because that would exclude, for example, visiting Mazatec people without medical licenses, but with hundreds, if not thousands of years of relationship to the mushroom. Again, what I think it's fundamentally important, an issue of human rights and basic dignity, that people following the Brazilian ayahuasca religions get permission to practice their spirituality in the global north. It would also be sad if that means that in order to be able to do their work, shamanic practitioners would now be forced to fit into the very narrow definition of religion that some of our countries have. And so on and so forth. Every time we fit psychedelics into the boxes we have, we find ourselves forcing them into the peg and excluding what doesn't fit. That's the unintended consequences that worry me, that opening one door would somehow close all the others. So the challenges that psychedelics present our societies is much larger than the current legal and scientific barriers. It is a cultural challenge. In a way, as a culture, we lack the proper frames, the tools, even the categories to fully integrate psychedelics into our societies yet. So the danger is that in the path of transforming the relationship of our societies with psychedelics, instead what we will do is transform psychedelics until our society, as it is today, can digest them, in the process losing much of their present richness. So now that everybody is depressed, let's look at some optimistic solutions in terms of what to do. My day job for many years was a user experience designer. I'm not going to go into what that means. I'll just say that we're often faced with situations like this. This is called the cow path metaphor, and it's another example of the law of unintended consequences. You make a great design, a beautiful plan, which is that very well laid out, route that you see over there. And then when you implement it, people go and do something else that was completely different. Now, faced with this, and this of course applies to like your plans for your children, for your career, your marriage, it's again and again, the best life plans end up with some of these. Now, faced with this disturbance, one could, for example, put a sign that says, do not step on the grass, or it is forbidden to step on the grass. Or one could put up a fence, at first maybe not so tall, and then even taller if people still were doing it. Or one could even have a cop come by every once in a while and fine people, But the fact is that people, pedestrians, they resent this. And with a good reason, because their path is more efficient. In a way, it's actually superior to the design, right? So the best solution, of course, is this. It's to pave the cow paths, right? Paving is bottom-up. It works from what it is. And at the same time, it's a contribution. It's an improvement on the cow paths, because when you pave them, it does away with the mud, it prevents slipping, etc., etc. Now, enlightened planners like this university can go even further. What they do, they made all the buildings, and they laid the grass, and they paved no paths. And they waited to see what paths people took, and then they paved those. Yeah, I'm almost there. So I like this example because it understands urbanism not as an exercise in central planning, but as a conversation between the population and the administration. That is, a conversation between the people and those in charge of managing the public good. So my time is running out, but I wanted to just present I just wanted to present a number of frames or concepts from which we've been working at ICEERS for a number of years now. This is what we try to do. We try to think about how the paths are going to be laid. We try to think about what are the best and optimal paths, even based on what people are already doing. And we try to, I'm done. I'll just say, sorry, the government is not going to do a good job at proposing how psychedelics should be regulated. It's that simple. And of course, as culture, we're not very well prepared to deal with it. But in this culture, there's no one better prepared than us. So it is up to the psychedelic community itself to begin to think of how they want to present proposals to the administration of how these things should be done. Because if we don't do it, it's going to happen the other way around. And that's the main issue of my talk. Thank you very much.